The morning Sarah Mitchell stepped into that small church in Portland, Oregon, she had no idea her world was about to shatter and rebuild itself in the same breath. She was there for a grief support group, clutching a worn photograph of her son Tommy, who had vanished without a trace 14 years earlier when he was just 8 years old. But as she settled into the circle of folding chairs, her eyes landed on a young man across the room, and time stopped completely. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about hope, loss, and the power of a mother's love. This is the story of Tommy Mitchell, the boy who disappeared from a crowded shopping mall in 2009, and the miraculous reunion that nobody saw coming. It was a typical Saturday afternoon in November when 8-year-old Tommy Mitchell vanished from the Eastgate shopping center in suburban Portland. Sarah had turned away for just 30 seconds to grab a birthday card from the rack. When she looked back, the spot where Tommy had been standing was empty. No scream, no struggle, just silence where her son's laughter had been moments before. The search began immediately. Mall security locked down the building, police flooded the area, and within hours, Tommy's face was on every news channel in Oregon. Sarah remembered the chaos of that first night, the flashing cameras, the endless questions, the growing pit of terror in her stomach as each hour passed without answers. Tommy was a bright kid, with sandy brown hair and curious green eyes, who loved dinosaurs and could recite every fact about velociraptors. He was wearing his favorite blue hoodie with a cartoon T-Rex on the front, jeans with grass stains on the knees, and light-up sneakers that blinked red when he walked. The investigation consumed Sarah's life. She quit her job as a dental hygienist to dedicate every waking moment to finding her son. Her husband, Mark, tried to be supportive, but the strain of living in perpetual crisis mode slowly ate away at their marriage. By the 3rd year, he had moved out, unable to handle Sarah's refusal to accept that Tommy might be gone forever. Friends and family members gradually stopped mentioning Tommy's name, their uncomfortable silence speaking volumes about what they believed had happened. But Sarah never gave up. She plastered missing person flyers on every telephone pole within a 100-mile radius. She learned to navigate police databases, joined online forums for families of missing children, and drove thousands of miles following up on tips that led nowhere. Her small apartment became a command center, with maps covering the walls, boxes of files stacked in every corner, and Tommy's bedroom preserved exactly as he had left it that morning 14 years ago. The years blurred together in a haze of false leads and crushing disappointments. There was the sighting in Sacramento that turned out to be another family's son. The phone call from a woman in Denver who was convinced she had seen Tommy at a bus station, only to discover she had been looking at a completely different child. Each dead end felt like losing Tommy all over again, but Sarah refused to stop searching. She attended every conference on missing children, learned about trafficking networks and underground adoption rings, and became an expert on the dark corners of society where stolen children might disappear. The police had long since moved Tommy's case to the cold files, but Sarah kept her own investigation active, following threads that law enforcement had either missed or abandoned. What sustained her through the darkest moments was an unshakable certainty that Tommy was still alive somewhere. Call it mother's intuition or desperate hope, but Sarah felt it in her bones. She would often wake up in the middle of the night with the absolute conviction that her son was trying to reach out to her somehow. She started keeping a journal, writing letters to Tommy every day, telling him about her life, and promising that she would never stop looking for him. The grief support group at Cedar Hills Community Church was supposed to be Sarah's attempt at healing. Her sister Linda had been begging her for months to try therapy, to find some way to process the trauma that had defined her life for over a decade. Sarah had resisted, viewing any form of acceptance as a betrayal of Tommy, but the loneliness had finally become unbearable. Cedar Hills was a modest church with worn carpets and mismatched furniture, the kind of place where people came not for show, but for genuine comfort. The grief support group met every Wednesday evening in the basement fellowship hall, a circle of folding chairs surrounded by inspirational posters and the faint smell of coffee from the kitchen next door. Sarah had attended 3 sessions when everything changed. She was sitting in her usual spot, half listening to Margaret Reynolds talk about losing her husband to cancer, when the door opened and a young man slipped quietly into the room. He was tall and thin, probably in his early 20s, with sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead and an apologetic smile as he found an empty chair. Pastor Williams, who led the group, welcomed the newcomer warmly. The young man introduced himself simply as David, explaining that he was dealing with some difficult memories from his childhood and hoped the group might help. His voice was soft but steady, with a maturity that seemed older than his years. Sarah found herself studying David's profile as he listened to the other group members share their stories. Something about him felt familiar in a way that made her chest tight with inexplicable emotion. When it was his turn to speak, David hesitated before sharing that he had grown up in what he now understood to be an abusive situation, and that he was trying to piece together fragments of his early childhood that felt more like dreams than memories. As the weeks passed, Sarah began looking forward to Wednesday evenings in a way she hadn't anticipated. David's presence brought a strange sense of peace to the group, and she found herself drawn to his quiet wisdom and the gentle way he offered comfort to others who were struggling. There was something about his mannerisms, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, that stirred memories she couldn't quite place. During their 4th session together, David mentioned that he had been raised by a woman he had called Aunt Ruth, though he now suspected she wasn't actually his relative. Ruth had homeschooled him and kept him isolated from other children, telling him that his parents had died in a car accident and that the outside world was dangerous. She had died when David was 16, and he had spent the years since then in foster care and group homes, trying to understand his own history. Sarah's hands began to tremble as David spoke. The way he unconsciously rubbed his left wrist when he was nervous was exactly the same habit Tommy had developed after breaking that arm falling from their backyard oak tree. The slight gap between his front teeth, barely noticeable unless you were really looking, matched the gap Tommy had been self-conscious about before he lost his baby teeth. But it was when David laughed at something Pastor Williams said that Sarah's world tilted completely off its axis. The sound was older, deeper, but unmistakably the same giggle that had filled their house with joy 22 years ago. Her son's laugh, aged and matured, but fundamentally unchanged. Sarah excused herself from the group and stumbled to the bathroom, where she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. She was 51 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when Tommy disappeared. Would he even recognize her if it really was him? And how could she possibly approach him without seeming like just another delusional parent seeing her lost child in every young face? The logical part of her brain insisted this was just wishful thinking, another false lead in a long series of disappointments. But her heart knew better. Every instinct she possessed was screaming that this young man calling himself David was actually Tommy Mitchell, her son who had been stolen from her 14 years ago in a shopping mall on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. When Sarah returned to the circle, David was sharing more about his fragmented memories. He mentioned recurring dreams about a woman with dark hair who used to read him stories about dinosaurs and a house with a tire swing in the backyard. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had read Tommy dinosaur books every night before bed, and Mark had hung a tire swing from their old oak tree the summer before Tommy disappeared. The session ended with Pastor Williams leading the group in a closing prayer, but Sarah barely heard the words. Her mind was racing, trying to figure out how to approach this situation without traumatizing David or destroying her own sanity if she was wrong. As the other members began filing out, she found herself walking toward the young man who might be her son. David was gathering his jacket when Sarah approached, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. She had rehearsed a dozen different opening lines during the closing prayer, but now that she was standing 3 feet away from him, every word evaporated from her mind. "Excuse me," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Sarah. I don't think we've properly met." David turned, offering that same gentle smile that had been haunting her thoughts for weeks. Up close, she could see more details that made her chest tighten with recognition. A small scar above his left eyebrow that matched the one Tommy had gotten from falling off his bicycle at age 6. The way his ears stuck out just slightly, something he had always been self-conscious about. Even the shape of his hands, long fingers that he kept fidgeting with, just like Tommy used to do when he was nervous. "Hi, Sarah," David replied, extending his hand. "I've noticed you in group. You seem like you carry a lot of pain." The observation was so mature, so perceptive, that Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. Tommy had always been an unusually empathetic child, the kind of kid who would comfort other children on the playground when they scraped their knees or felt left out of games. "I've been coming here because I lost someone very important to me," Sarah said carefully, studying his face for any flicker of recognition. "A long time ago." David nodded sympathetically. "Loss changes everything, doesn't it? Sometimes I feel like I'm mourning people I can't even remember properly." The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady herself, fighting the urge to reach out and touch his face, to trace the features that had haunted her dreams for 14 years. "David," she said, trying to keep her voice level, "can I ask you something? Do you remember anything specific about your life before you went to live with Ruth?" Something shifted in David's expression. His eyes, those familiar green eyes that she had stared into countless times while reading bedtime stories, grew distant and troubled. "Sometimes," he said slowly. "Fragments, mostly. I remember a woman singing to me, something about 5 little monkeys jumping on a bed. And there was a man who used to throw me up in the air and catch me. I'd laugh so hard I could barely breathe." Sarah's knees nearly gave out. She had sung that exact song to Tommy every night, and Mark had played that same game with him in their living room until the neighbors downstairs complained about the noise. "What else?" she whispered, afraid to push too hard but desperate for more confirmation. David ran his hand through his hair, a gesture so achingly familiar that Sarah had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. "There was a dog, I think, small and white with brown spots, and I remember being in a store, lots of people around, and then—" He trailed off, his brow furrowing in concentration. "And then what?" Sarah prompted gently. "Nothing," David said, shaking his head in frustration. "It's like the memory just stops. Ruth always told me I was in a car accident that gave me amnesia, that my parents died and she was the only family I had left. But lately, I've been wondering if that was true." Sarah felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to either fly or fall into an abyss. This was the moment she had dreamed of and feared in equal measure for 14 years. Taking a shaky breath, she pulled out her phone and scrolled to a photo she had looked at thousands of times. "David," she said, her voice trembling, "I need you to look at something." She held up the phone, showing him the last picture she had taken of Tommy. He was 8 years old, grinning at the camera with that gap-toothed smile, wearing his favorite dinosaur t-shirt. His sandy hair was messy from playing outside, and his green eyes sparkled with mischief. David stared at the image for a long moment, his face going pale. "Who is this?" he asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew. "That's my son Tommy," Sarah said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "He disappeared from Eastgate Mall 14 years ago. He would be 22 now, exactly your age." The phone slipped from David's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. He took a step backward, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "That's not possible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm David Thompson. I've always been David Thompson." Sarah bent to retrieve her phone, then slowly approached him again. Tommy loved dinosaurs more than anything in the world. He could tell you every fact about velociraptors. He had a stuffed triceratops named Spike that he couldn't sleep without. He broke his left arm when he was 6, falling from our oak tree while trying to reach a bird's nest. With each detail, David's face grew more ashen. He was staring at Sarah now, with an expression of dawning horror and recognition. He had a tire swing in the backyard, Sarah continued softly. His father hung it from the biggest branch, and every night before bed, I would read him stories about dinosaurs and sing him a song about 5 little monkeys. Stop, David whispered, backing against the wall. Please stop. But Sarah couldn't stop. 14 years of suppressed words came pouring out like a dam bursting. He was wearing a blue hoodie the day he disappeared, light-up sneakers that blinked red when he walked. He had been begging me to buy him a new Jurassic Park book, and I told him we'd get it after we picked up his father's birthday card. I turned away for 30 seconds. 30 seconds, and when I looked back, he was gone. David slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. I remember the sneakers, he said in a voice so quiet Sarah almost missed it. They made me feel like I could run faster than anyone. The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross. Sarah wanted nothing more than to wrap her arms around this young man and hold him the way she had dreamed of doing for 14 years. But she could see the terror in his eyes, the overwhelming confusion of a person whose entire understanding of their identity was crumbling. Pastor Williams, who had been quietly organizing chairs in the corner, approached them with concern, written across his weathered features. Is everything all right over here? Sarah looked from the pastor to David, who was now sliding down the wall to sit on the floor with his head in his hands. I think, she said carefully, that we might need some help processing this. The pastor's eyes widened as he took in the scene, the emotional weight of whatever had just transpired, obvious even without context. Perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private, he suggested. My office is just upstairs. David looked up at them with eyes that seemed much younger than his 22 years. Am I really him? He asked Sarah. Am I really your son? Sarah knelt beside him, fighting every maternal instinct that screamed at her to touch him, to comfort him the way she had when he was small and frightened. I believe you are, she said softly, but I know this is overwhelming. We don't have to figure everything out tonight. Ruth always said my parents were dead, David said, his voice breaking. She said I was lucky she took me in, that nobody else wanted me. She said if I ever tried to leave or tell anyone about our life together, something terrible would happen. The words sent ice through Sarah's veins. What kind of life did you have with her? David's face closed off, and Sarah could see him retreating into himself, the way trauma survivors often did when memories became too painful to bear. She kept me inside mostly, said the world was dangerous, that people would hurt me if they found me. I wasn't allowed to go to school or play with other kids. She homeschooled me, but mostly she just had me doing chores and staying quiet. Sarah felt a rage building in her chest, unlike anything she had ever experienced. Someone had stolen her child, and then spent years systematically isolating and controlling him. The lost years stretched before her like a chasm, all the birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments they would never get back. Did she hurt you? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she was prepared for the answer. David was quiet for a long moment. Not physically, mostly, but she had ways of making sure I didn't ask questions or cause problems. She said my real parents gave me away because I was too much trouble, that I should be grateful she was willing to keep me. The cruelty of it took Sarah's breath away. To steal a child and then convince them they were unwanted, unloved, abandoned by choice rather than circumstance. She could only imagine the psychological damage such lies would inflict on a developing mind. Pastor Williams had been listening with growing alarm. David, I think you need to know that none of what this woman told you was true. Parents don't give their children away at shopping malls. And Sarah here has spent 14 years searching for you. She never stopped believing you were alive." David looked at Sarah with an expression of cautious hope mixed with disbelief. "You looked for me?" "Every single day," Sarah said, her voice fierce with conviction. "I never gave up. I never stopped loving you. Your room at home is exactly the way you left it. Your stuffed triceratops is still on your bed." "Spike," David whispered, and Sarah felt her heart soar. "Yes, Spike. He's been waiting for you." The three of them sat in the church basement as the weight of revelations settled around them like dust after an earthquake. Sarah wanted to ask a million questions, to fill in every gap of the lost years, but she could see that David was already overwhelmed by what he had learned. "What happens now?" David asked, looking between Sarah and Pastor Williams. "Now," Sarah said carefully, "we take this one step at a time. There will need to be DNA tests to confirm what we both already know in our hearts. The police will want to investigate what happened to you and who this Ruth woman really was. But most importantly, we figure out how to be a family again." David nodded slowly, then looked at Sarah with those green eyes that had never left her dreams. "Can I ask you something? Anything? Do you think you could still love me, even though I'm not the little boy you lost? I'm different now. Damaged, maybe." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of relief and overwhelming love. "Tommy," she said, using his real name for the first time in 14 years, "you are my son. Nothing could ever change that. You're not damaged. You're a survivor. And I have loved you every single day since the moment you were born." For the first time since she had approached him, David smiled. It was tentative and fragile, but it was real. And in that smile, Sarah could see glimpses of the little boy who used to chase fireflies in their backyard and beg for one more dinosaur story before bed. The road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be therapy and legal proceedings and the complicated process of rebuilding a relationship that had been violently severed. But sitting in that church basement, looking at her son's face for the first time in 14 years, Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered in a plain manila envelope that Sarah held with trembling hands for nearly 10 minutes before opening. She already knew what the lab report would confirm, but seeing the words in black and white made it real in a way that no amount of maternal certainty could match. Probability of paternity: 99.97%. The number blurred through her tears as she sank into the kitchen chair where she'd eaten countless solitary meals over the past 14 years. Tommy was alive. Her son was alive, and he was sitting in a counseling session across town at that very moment, trying to piece together the fragments of a childhood that had been stolen from him. Detective Maria Santos had reopened Tommy's case the day after the DNA confirmation. Sarah found herself back in the familiar environment of police stations and interview rooms, but this time as the mother of a found child rather than a missing one. The shift in perspective was dizzying. "We need to understand exactly what happened during those 14 years," Detective Santos explained, her voice gentle but professional. "David's testimony about his life with Ruth Kellerman is crucial evidence, but we're also looking into her background, her associates, anyone who might have been involved in the initial abduction." Ruth Kellerman. Even the woman's real name felt like a violation. Sarah had spent weeks researching everything she could find about the person who had raised her son in captivity. Ruth had been 53 when she died of a heart attack in a grocery store parking lot, leaving 16-year-old David to fend for himself. She had no family, no close friends, and a history of mental illness that included multiple hospitalizations for delusional episodes. What emerged from the investigation was a picture of a deeply disturbed woman who had convinced herself that she was saving children from neglectful parents. Ruth had worked as a store clerk at Eastgate Mall for 3 months, leading up to Tommy's disappearance, giving her ample opportunity to observe families and select her target. "She watched you," Detective Santos told Sarah during one particularly difficult briefing. "Security footage shows her following you and Tommy through the mall for over an hour before the abduction. She knew your routine, knew you always stopped at the greeting card section, knew Tommy would wander toward the toy displays." The premeditation of it made Sarah sick. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity, but a calculated theft carried out by someone who had studied their family like a predator stalking prey. Ruth had waited for the perfect moment when Sarah was distracted, then simply walked up to Tommy and told him his mother was looking for him near the exit. "Children that age are conditioned to trust adults," Detective Santos explained. "She probably seemed like a helpful store employee or security guard. By the time Tommy realized something was wrong, she had already gotten him out of the mall and into her car." The physical evidence was limited after so many years, but Tommy's memories were slowly returning through therapy sessions with Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a specialist in recovered memory and childhood trauma. The process was painstaking and emotionally devastating, but each recovered fragment brought them closer to understanding what he had endured. Tommy remembered the car ride from the mall, how Ruth had told him they were going on a special adventure to find his parents, who were waiting for him at her house. He remembered the confusion when they arrived at a rundown apartment instead of the reunion he'd been promised. Ruth had locked him in a bedroom and told him his parents had changed their minds about wanting him, that they had asked her to take care of him instead. "She was very good at psychological manipulation," Dr. Harper explained to Sarah after one of Tommy's sessions. "She isolated him completely, then positioned herself as his only source of comfort and security. It's a classic pattern in cases of long-term captivity." The apartment had been the first of many temporary homes as Ruth moved them around the Pacific Northwest, never staying in one place long enough to attract attention. She homeschooled Tommy using outdated textbooks and religious materials that emphasized obedience and acceptance of one's circumstances. She told him his real name was David Thompson, and that his previous life had been just a series of bad dreams. "She made me write essays about being grateful," Tommy told Sarah one evening as they sat in her living room, slowly learning how to be around each other again. "Every week, I had to write about how lucky I was that she saved me from parents who didn't want me. If I wrote anything she didn't like, she'd make me stay in my room for days with nothing but bread and water." Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she listened. The systematic brainwashing her son had endured was beyond cruel. It was a form of psychological torture designed to erase his identity and replace it with something Ruth could control. "Did you ever try to escape?" Sarah asked, though she immediately regretted the question when she saw Tommy's face close off. "A few times when I was younger," he admitted, "but she always found me. And after each attempt, she'd move us somewhere new, and the restrictions would get tighter. Eventually, I stopped trying. I started believing what she told me about my parents not wanting me back." The guilt that washed over Sarah in that moment was overwhelming. While she had been searching desperately for her son, he had been convinced that she had abandoned him willingly. Ruth had weaponized his love for his parents, turning it into a source of shame and self-doubt that had shaped his entire adolescence. Dr. Harper worked with both Tommy and Sarah on rebuilding their relationship while processing the trauma of their separation. The sessions were emotionally brutal, filled with tears and accusations, and moments of profound grief for the years they had lost. "You can't expect to pick up where you left off," Dr. Harper warned them. "Tommy was 8 when he was taken. He's 22 now. You're both different people than you were 14 years ago. The goal isn't to recreate the past, but to build something new together." The process was complicated by Tommy's struggle with his own identity. He had spent more years as David Thompson than as Tommy Mitchell, and the transition back to his original name felt foreign and uncomfortable. Some days he felt like Tommy, the dinosaur-obsessed little boy who had loved tire swings and bedtime stories. Other days he felt like David, the guarded young man who had learned to survive by being invisible and compliant. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be," he confessed to Sarah one afternoon, as they sorted through boxes of his childhood belongings that she had preserved. "When I look at these toys and pictures, I remember loving them, but it feels like remembering someone else's life." Sarah picked up a small plastic velociraptor from the box, one of dozens of dinosaur figures Tommy had collected before his disappearance. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself," she said, "whether that's Tommy or David, or some combination of both. I just want to know the person you are now, not force you to be the person you were then." The legal proceedings surrounding Ruth Kellerman's crimes were complicated by her death, but prosecutors were determined to build a case that would provide closure for the Mitchell family and potentially uncover other victims. Ruth's apartment had been cleared out by the state after her death, but investigators managed to track down some of her personal belongings that had been stored in a public storage unit. What they found there chilled Sarah to the bone. Ruth had kept detailed journals documenting her years with Tommy, filled with delusional ramblings about saving him from unfit parents and preparing him for a better life. She had also kept photographs of other children, newspaper clippings about missing kids from across the country, and what appeared to be surveillance notes about several families. "We believe Ruth may have been planning additional abductions," Detective Santos told Sarah and Tommy during a briefing 6 months after their reunion. "The evidence suggests she saw herself as some kind of child rescue operation. We're working with federal investigators to determine if there might be other victims out there. The possibility that there were other families still searching for children Ruth had stolen was heartbreaking." Sarah thought about the years she had spent in online forums and support groups, connecting with other parents whose children had vanished without a trace. How many of those cases might be connected to Ruth Kellerman? Tommy struggled with the knowledge that his abduction might not have been an isolated incident. The survivor's guilt was compounded by the realization that his captor had viewed him as the first of many children she planned to save from their families. "She used to talk about getting me a little brother or sister," he told Dr. Harper during one session. "I thought she meant adopting legally, but now I wonder if she was planning to take another child. The idea that I might have been her practice run for other kidnappings makes me sick." As spring turned to summer, Sarah and Tommy began establishing new routines together. He moved into the apartment above her garage, giving him independence while keeping them close enough to support each other through the difficult process of rebuilding their relationship. Some days were better than others. Tommy had nightmares that left him shaking and disoriented, unable to distinguish between past and present. Sarah had panic attacks when he left the house, her mind conjuring worst-case scenarios despite knowing he was safe. They both jumped at unexpected sounds, watched exits in public places, and struggled with the hypervigilance that comes from years of trauma. But there were moments of pure joy that reminded Sarah why she had never given up hope. The first time Tommy laughed at one of her terrible jokes, really laughed the way he used to as a child, she cried for an hour afterward. When he asked her to teach him how to make her famous chocolate chip cookies, using the same recipe she had used when he was 8, she felt like her heart might burst from happiness. The media attention surrounding their reunion was intense but brief. Sarah gave one carefully controlled interview to the local news station, hoping to raise awareness about long-term abduction cases and the possibility of recovery even after many years. She also wanted other families to know that hope was not foolish, that sometimes the impossible did happen. "I never stopped believing Tommy was alive," she told the reporter, "even when everyone else told me to accept that he was gone. Something inside me knew he was out there somewhere, waiting for me to find him. I want other parents to know that their instincts matter, that their love matters, and that miracles do happen." The interview generated hundreds of calls and emails from other families dealing with missing children cases. Sarah found herself becoming an informal advocate, connecting newly bereaved parents with support resources and sharing the hard-won wisdom she had gained during her 14-year search. Tommy was more reluctant to engage with the public attention, but he eventually agreed to participate in a documentary about recovered memory and long-term captivity cases. His story became part of a larger conversation about child abduction, psychological manipulation, and the resilience of the human spirit. As autumn approached, Tommy made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He wanted to visit the mall where he had been taken, to confront the place where his childhood had ended and his captivity had begun. "I need to see it," he explained to Sarah and Dr. Harper. "I need to stand in that spot and remember what really happened, not the version Ruth told me. I need to take back my own story." The visit was planned carefully, with Dr. Harper present and security arrangements made to protect their privacy. Sarah's hands shook as they walked through the entrance of Eastgate Mall for the first time together since that terrible day 14 years earlier. The layout had changed over the years. The greeting card section where Sarah had been standing was now a cell phone accessories kiosk. The toy displays that had caught Tommy's attention had been replaced by a jewelry store. But the bones of the place remained the same, and Sarah could feel the weight of memory pressing down on them both. Tommy stood in the approximate spot where he had been standing when Ruth approached him, his eyes closed in concentration. "I remember her now," he said quietly. "She had grey hair and a blue vest, like the store employees wore. She seemed nice, grandmotherly. She told me my mom was worried about me and wanted her to help me find the exit." Sarah watched her son process the memory of his own abduction, seeing him reclaim ownership of an experience that had been distorted and weaponized against him for years. It was simultaneously heartbreaking and healing to witness. "She wasn't saving me," Tommy continued, his voice growing stronger. "She was stealing me, and she spent 14 years trying to make me believe it was for my own good." They didn't stay long at the mall, but the visit marked a turning point in Tommy's recovery. He began speaking more freely about his experiences with Ruth, no longer protecting her memory or making excuses for her behavior. He started referring to his time in captivity as exactly that, captivity, rather than the alternative childhood Ruth had convinced him it was. The investigation into Ruth's crimes continued to expand as investigators uncovered more evidence of her fixation on child abduction. They found drafts of letters she had never sent to newspaper advice columnists, asking hypothetical questions about children whose parents were unfit and whether intervention might be justified. They discovered she had attended parenting classes and child psychology seminars, apparently researching how to better manipulate and control the children she planned to take. Most disturbing of all, they found a second storage unit that contained detailed files on 12 other families, complete with photographs, daily routine observations, and psychological profiles of both parents and children. Ruth had been planning a systematic campaign of child theft, with Tommy as her first success. "The level of premeditation is staggering," Detective Santos told Sarah during one of their final meetings. She had been planning this for years before she took Tommy, and based on what we found, she was planning to continue for years afterward. None of the other families Ruth had been stalking had lost children, but investigators reached out to warn them about the surveillance they had unknowingly been under. The knowledge that they had been targeted by a predator was traumatic, but several families expressed gratitude for the closure and the peace of mind that came with knowing the threat was gone. As the first anniversary of their reunion approached, Sarah and Tommy began planning a quiet celebration, not of the abduction or the lost years, but of their survival and their determination to build a future together, despite everything they had endured. Tommy had enrolled in community college classes and was working part-time at a local animal shelter, finding peace in caring for abandoned pets who reminded him of his own journey from captivity to freedom. He was considering studying social work or psychology, wanting to help other survivors of childhood trauma. "I want to turn what happened to me into something useful," he told Sarah. "Ruth tried to destroy my life, but maybe I can use my experience to help other people heal from similar experiences." Sarah had returned to work as a dental hygienist, but she also volunteered with organizations that supported families of missing children. The networking skills and investigative techniques she had developed during her search for Tommy proved invaluable in helping other families navigate the complex systems involved in missing persons cases. Their relationship continued to evolve as they learned to trust each other again. There were setbacks and misunderstandings, moments when the gap of 14 years felt insurmountable. But there were also breakthrough moments when they connected across time and trauma. When Sarah could see glimpses of the little boy she had lost in the strong young man he had become. The legal resolution of Tommy's case came in the form of a settlement with the mall's insurance company and a formal apology from the security firm that had been responsible for monitoring the premises in 2009. The money wasn't important to Sarah, but the acknowledgement of institutional failure provided some measure of accountability for the systemic breakdowns that had allowed Ruth to operate undetected. More meaningful was the policy changes implemented at shopping centres across the region in response to Tommy's case. New protocols for handling lost children, improved training for security personnel, and enhanced cooperation with law enforcement all emerged from the lessons learned during the investigation. As winter settled over Portland again, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The grief support group at Cedar Hills Community Church had become a source of genuine healing rather than desperate searching. She and Tommy attended together now, sharing their story with others who were struggling with loss and trauma. Pastor Williams often commented on the transformation he had witnessed in both of them over the past year. When Sarah first joined our group, she was consumed by the search for her son, he observed. Now she's focused on building a relationship with the son she found. That shift from seeking to being present is what healing looks like. Tommy's nightmares had become less frequent, though they hadn't disappeared entirely. He still struggled with anxiety in crowded places and had difficulty trusting his own memories about events from his childhood. But he was learning to live with the uncertainty rather than being paralyzed by it. I may never remember everything that happened during those 14 years, he told Dr. Harper during one of their sessions. And maybe that's okay. Maybe some things are better left buried. What matters is that I'm here now, and I get to decide what happens next. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain, but no longer hopeless. Sarah had her son back, not in the way she had imagined during all those years of searching, but in a way that was real and precious and worth every moment of pain they had endured to reach this point. The breakthrough in understanding what had really happened to Tommy came from an unexpected source. Detective Santos received a call from a retired postal worker in Eugene, Oregon, who had seen the news coverage about Tommy's case and recognized Ruth Kellerman's photograph from the television report. "I delivered mail to that woman for 3 years," Harold Brennan told Detective Santos during their phone interview. "She lived in this little house on Maple Street, kept to herself mostly, but there was always something off about the situation. She had this kid with her, never saw him playing outside or going to school. When I asked her about it once, she got real defensive, said he was homeschooled and had health problems that kept him indoors." Harold's testimony provided investigators with their first concrete timeline of Tommy's captivity. The house on Maple Street had been Ruth's longest-term residence, where she and Tommy had lived for nearly 4 years, when he was between the ages of 10 and 14. Neighbors from that period began coming forward with their own observations, painting a picture of a woman who had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep her stolen child hidden from the world. "She had blackout curtains in every window," remembered Janet Morrison, who had lived next door to Ruth during those years. "Never saw the boy outside, not even in the backyard. Sometimes I'd hear music playing from the house, always the same songs over and over. Classical stuff, but played so loud it seemed like she was trying to drown out other sounds." The music detail sent chills through both Sarah and Tommy. During his therapy sessions, Tommy had mentioned recurring memories of being forced to listen to the same classical pieces for hours at a time as punishment for asking questions about his past or expressing desire to go outside. "She said it would help cleanse my mind of bad thoughts," Tommy explained to Dr. Harper. "If I mentioned wanting to see my real parents or asked about other kids my age, she'd make me sit in this chair and listen to the same violin concerto for the entire day. I learned to hate classical music because of that. The investigation expanded to include a thorough examination of Ruth's financial records during the years she held Tommy captive. What they discovered revealed the calculated nature of her crimes extended far beyond the initial abduction. Ruth had systematically collected welfare benefits and disability payments using forged documents that listed Tommy as her dependent nephew, suffering from severe autism and intellectual disabilities. She was essentially profiting from his captivity, Detective Santos explained to Sarah during one of their meetings. The monthly payments she received for his care gave her the financial stability to maintain their nomadic lifestyle and avoid detection. She had turned your son into a source of income. The fraud charges that would have been brought against Ruth had she lived provided some measure of justice, even in her absence. The state recovered nearly $60,000 that had been fraudulently claimed over the years, money that was eventually awarded to Tommy as partial compensation for his suffering. But the financial aspects of the case were overshadowed by the continuing discovery of Ruth's psychological manipulation tactics. Dr. Harper worked with Tommy to uncover more memories of his daily life in captivity, helping him understand how Ruth had used sophisticated techniques to maintain control over him. She created a complete alternate reality for him, Dr. Harper explained to Sarah. Every piece of information he received about the outside world was filtered through her distorted worldview. She convinced him that his parents had died in a car accident shortly after giving him away, that the world was too dangerous for someone like him, and that she was the only person who could keep him safe. One of the most disturbing revelations came when Tommy remembered Ruth showing him fabricated newspaper articles about his supposed parents' deaths. She had created fake obituaries and accident reports using an old computer and printer, complete with doctored photographs and false details designed to convince him that returning to his former life was impossible. She showed me the articles on my 15th birthday, Tommy recalled, during a particularly difficult therapy session. She said it was time I knew the truth about what had happened to my real family. I cried for days, mourning people I couldn't even remember clearly anymore. Now I realized she was mourning the parents who were still alive and still searching for me. The cruelty of Ruth's deception was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. She had anticipated Tommy's natural desire to reconnect with his origins as he matured and had prepared elaborate lies to crush that hope before it could take root. Every question he asked about his past was met with carefully constructed fiction designed to reinforce his dependence on her. Sarah found herself grappling with rage, unlike anything she had ever experienced. The woman who had stolen her son had not simply taken him away. She had spent years systematically destroying his sense of identity and self-worth. Ruth had weaponized Tommy's love for his family, turning it into a source of grief and abandonment that shaped his entire adolescence. "I want to hate her," Sarah confessed to Dr. Harper during one of her individual sessions. "I want to hate her with every fiber of my being for what she did to him, what she did to our family. But Tommy still has complicated feelings about her, and I don't want my anger to make his healing process harder." Dr. Harper nodded understandingly. "It's natural for you to feel intense anger about what Ruth did. She committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. But you're right to be mindful of how you express that anger around Tommy. His relationship with Ruth was complex, and he needs space to process his own feelings without being influenced by yours." The complexity of Tommy's feelings toward his captor was one of the most challenging aspects of his recovery. Despite understanding intellectually that Ruth had committed terrible crimes against him, part of him still felt loyalty toward the woman who had been his primary caregiver for 14 years. "She wasn't always cruel," Tommy explained to Sarah one evening as they walked through the park near her apartment. "There were times when she seemed to genuinely care about me, when she'd comfort me if I was sick or scared. I know now that it was all part of her manipulation, but those moments felt real at the time. It's confusing to hate someone who was also the closest thing to a mother figure I had during those years. Sarah struggled to understand how Tommy could have any positive feelings toward Ruth, but Dr. Harper helped her recognize that his emotional complexity was actually a sign of psychological resilience rather than weakness. Survivors of long-term captivity often develop complicated relationships with their captors, Dr. Harper explained. Tommy's ability to see Ruth as a whole person, rather than simply a monster, shows that she wasn't able to completely destroy his capacity for empathy and nuanced thinking. That's actually quite remarkable given what he endured. As spring arrived again, marking nearly 2 years since their reunion, Sarah and Tommy began discussing the possibility of visiting some of the places where he had lived during his captivity. The idea terrified Sarah, but Tommy felt it was necessary for his continued healing. "I need to see those places as an adult," he explained. "When I lived there, I was just a kid trying to survive. Now I want to go back and reclaim those memories, understand them from my current perspective, instead of through the lens of fear and confusion." They started with the house on Maple Street in Eugene, the place where Tommy had spent the longest continuous period of his captivity. The current owners, a young family with 2 small children, had graciously agreed to let them walk through the property after Detective Santos contacted them and explained the situation. The house looked smaller and more ordinary than Tommy remembered. The blackout curtains were gone, replaced with cheerful yellow panels that let sunlight stream through the windows. The backyard, where he had never been allowed to play, was now filled with playground equipment and children's toys. "She always told me the yard was too dangerous," Tommy said, as he stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the swing set where 2 young children were playing. "She said there were people watching who might try to hurt me if they saw me outside. Now I realize she was just afraid someone would see me and ask questions." Sarah watched her son process the geography of his former prison, seeing him reclaim ownership of spaces that had been used to control and isolate him. The visit was emotionally difficult, but ultimately empowering for Tommy, helping him understand that the fears Ruth had instilled in him were products of her manipulation rather than genuine threats. They also visited the apartment complex in Bend, where Ruth and Tommy had lived during his early teenage years. The manager showed them the unit where they had resided, now occupied by a college student who was curious about the history of her temporary home. "It's so small," Tommy observed as they stood in the cramped living room. "I remember it feeling huge when I was younger, but it's actually tiny." She had me convinced that this was a normal way to live, that most kids didn't have much space or freedom. The perspective shift was profound for Tommy, helping him understand how Ruth had distorted his perception of normal childhood experiences. By keeping him isolated from other children and families, she had prevented him from recognizing how abnormal his situation truly was. Detective Santos continued working to build a comprehensive timeline of Ruth's movements during the 14 years she held Tommy captive. Bank records, rental agreements, and utility bills painted a picture of constant relocation designed to avoid detection. Ruth had moved them to a new address, an average of every 18 months, never staying anywhere long enough for Tommy to form relationships or for neighbors to become suspicious. She was methodical about it, Detective Santos explained. She'd scout out locations in advance, always choosing places where people kept to themselves and didn't ask too many questions. Rural areas, low-income housing complexes, neighborhoods with high turnover rates. She knew exactly how to stay invisible. The investigation also revealed that Ruth had been receiving disability benefits under her own name for a fabricated mental health condition, providing additional income that supported their transient lifestyle. She had claimed to suffer from severe agoraphobia and anxiety that prevented her from maintaining steady employment, when in reality she was using those supposed limitations as cover for her criminal activities. She was much more sophisticated than we initially realized, Detective Santos admitted. This wasn't the work of someone who was simply mentally ill and acting on impulse. She had planned every aspect of this crime and its aftermath with remarkable precision. The discovery of Ruth's calculated approach to the abduction and captivity helped Tommy understand that nothing about his experience had been random or spontaneous. Ruth had chosen him specifically, had observed his family's routines, and had waited for the perfect opportunity to execute her plan. Knowing that she targeted me makes it feel less like something I could have prevented, Tommy told Dr. Harper. When I was younger, I used to blame myself for walking away from my mom at the mall, for trusting a stranger who seemed nice. Now I understand that she would have found a way to take me regardless of what I did that day. As Tommy's healing progressed, he began expressing interest in connecting with other survivors of long-term captivity and abduction. Dr. Harper connected him with a support group for adults who had experienced childhood trauma, where he found others who understood the unique challenges of recovering from extended periods of psychological manipulation. It helps to talk to people who've been through similar experiences, Tommy told Sarah after attending his first group meeting. They understand things that other people can't, like how confusing it is to have complicated feelings about someone who hurt you, or how hard it is to trust your own memories when they've been distorted for so long. The support group became an important part of Tommy's ongoing recovery, providing him with peer connections and coping strategies from people who had walked similar paths. Several group members had been held captive by family members or acquaintances for years before escaping or being rescued, and their stories helped Tommy feel less isolated in his experience. Sarah also found support through online communities for families affected by long-term abductions. The number of similar cases was smaller than she had expected, but the connections she made with other parents were invaluable for understanding the unique challenges of reunion after extended separation. "We're all learning as we go," explained Margaret Chen, whose daughter had been recovered after 8 years in captivity. "There's no handbook for rebuilding a relationship with a child who's been gone for so long. We just have to be patient with ourselves and with them, and remember that healing isn't linear." The legal aspects of Tommy's case continued to evolve as prosecutors worked to build charges against anyone who might have assisted Ruth in her crimes. While Ruth herself was beyond the reach of justice, investigators were determined to hold accountable anyone who had helped her maintain Tommy's captivity. Their efforts led to the arrest of Marcus Webb, a former co-worker of Ruth's, who had provided her with forged identity documents over the years. Webb had created fake birth certificates, social security cards, and school records that allowed Ruth to establish false identities for both herself and Tommy in various states. Webb knew exactly what these documents were being used for, prosecutor Amanda Rodriguez explained to Sarah and Tommy. He charged Ruth premium prices for high-quality forgeries, and when she told him they were for a child she was protecting from abusive parents, he chose to believe her story without asking any questions. Webb's trial provided additional details about the infrastructure that had supported Ruth's crimes. He had been part of a network of document forgers who catered to people trying to disappear from their past lives, asking few questions about their clients' motivations as long as they paid in cash. The underground economy that enabled Ruth's crimes is larger than most people realize, Detective Santos explained. There are people out there making money by helping others create false identities, and they don't particularly care whether their clients are running from debt, abusive relationships, or criminal prosecution. The revelation that Ruth had access to professional quality forged documents helped explain how she had been able to maintain Tommy's false identity for so long. Every interaction with schools, healthcare providers, and government agencies had been supported by convincing paperwork that established David Thompson as a real person with a legitimate history. Tommy found the trial proceedings emotionally difficult, but ultimately validating. Seeing Webb convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison provided tangible evidence that what had happened to him was taken seriously by the legal system, even if the primary perpetrator was beyond punishment. "It matters that someone is being held accountable," Tommy told Sarah after Webb's sentencing. "I know it doesn't bring back the years we lost, but it shows that what Ruth did to me was recognized as a serious crime, not just a family dispute or custody issue." As the 3rd anniversary of their reunion approached, Sarah and Tommy began planning a memorial service for the childhood that had been stolen from him. The idea had emerged during one of their therapy sessions as a way to formally acknowledge the losses they had both experienced while celebrating their survival and recovery. "We need to mourn the little boy who was taken and the mother who spent 14 years searching," Dr. Harper suggested. "That grief is real and valid, even though you've been reunited. Acknowledging those losses will help you both move forward without carrying that pain as a burden." The memorial service was held at Cedar Hills Community Church, the same place where Sarah and Tommy had first recognized each other 3 years earlier. Pastor Williams led a simple ceremony that honored both the pain of their separation and the miracle of their reunion. Sarah spoke about the little boy she had lost and the strong young man she had found. Tommy read a letter he had written to his younger self, offering comfort and encouragement to the frightened child who had been convinced that his family no longer wanted him. "You were never abandoned," Tommy read, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "You were stolen, and that's not the same thing. The people who loved you never stopped looking, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing you would come home someday." The ceremony marked a turning point in their healing journey. Rather than continuing to focus primarily on recovery from trauma, they began building new traditions and creating positive memories together. Sarah taught Tommy to drive, something he had never had the opportunity to learn during his captivity. They took a road trip to the Oregon coast, where Tommy saw the ocean for the first time since he was 8 years old. "Ruth always told me the ocean was too dangerous," Tommy said, as they walked along the beach at sunset. "She said the waves would pull me under if I got too close. I believed her, but now I think she was just afraid that being around other people would make me realize how abnormal our life was." The ocean became a powerful symbol of freedom for Tommy. He learned to swim in the gentle waves, something Ruth had never allowed him to do. The physical sensation of floating in the salt water felt like washing away years of imposed limitations and artificial fears. Sarah watched her son embrace new experiences with a mixture of joy and heartbreak. Every milestone he reached reminded her of all the ordinary childhood moments that had been stolen from him, but also demonstrated his remarkable resilience and determination to reclaim his life. "Sometimes I feel guilty about being happy," Sarah confessed to Dr. Harper during one of their sessions. "Tommy lost 14 years of his childhood, and here I am celebrating because he learned to drive or graduated from community college. It feels like I'm trivializing what was taken from him." Dr. Harper shook her head firmly. "Joy and grief can coexist, Sarah. Celebrating Tommy's achievements now doesn't diminish the tragedy of what he lost. If anything, it honors his strength and your perseverance. You both deserve to experience happiness after everything you've survived." Tommy enrolled in a bachelor's degree program in social work, inspired by his own experiences and the professionals who had helped him heal. His goal was to work with other survivors of childhood trauma, using his understanding of captivity and recovery to help others navigate their own journeys toward freedom and healing. "I want to be the kind of person I needed when I was 14 and didn't know who I really was," Tommy explained to Sarah. "I want to help kids who've been told lies about themselves learn to recognize the truth about their own worth." Sarah and Tommy's story reminds us that hope isn't foolish, even when the world tells us to give up. A mother's love proved stronger than 14 years of separation, and a young man's resilience overcame systematic psychological manipulation designed to erase his identity. Their reunion in that small Portland church wasn't just the end of a nightmare. It was proof that some bonds can never truly be broken. If you found this story as incredible as we did, make sure to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to believe in miracles today.